When we try to recall certain information, what do we get? We get visuals, we get smells, we get certain people, their appearances, their dresses, their clothes, certain emotions that are associated with those events. We get lots of things brought back when we try to recall certain information of certain events. And when we try to explain what happened in those events, giving out these details of those events, what happened to the people who like to know about certain stories, we basically translate from our memory into text. And we don't really exactly remember the visuals, the exact visuals, what somebody looked like. All we get is certain a vast array of emotions associated with those events, and then we try to explain, recount those events. We're trying to choose the right words to explain what happened. That's how we remember things and how we communicate what happened in our lives. So now you want to do that in your second language. You like to explain to people that what your life experience have been like in your second language, or people from different cultures, or people, the native speakers of your second language. So, but then what you don't have here is the vocabulary, certain expressions or the phrases or certain fixed expressions and phrasal verbs, whatever you call it. Let's say you try to explain what happened, your school life, your high school life, back in your high school, and you like to talk about your first love or your best friends back then, and still maybe you keep in touch. What you need to do here is you just have to play out in your head, like I said before in the beginning of this podcast, and try to notice what vocabulary, what sort of expressions would be most suitable for describing those events. If your second language doesn't have the synonymous words or phrases to describe or illustrate those events, then you'll have to add more explanations to the person you're talking to, explaining the cultural difference. For instance, the school life in South Korea and school life in the West, I think, is in many aspects quite substantially different. So, even if you play out your school years in your second language, there are cultural elements that you have to additionally explain. And these things are not really translatable. You have to either invent a new word to explain exactly what you mean by that, or you have to add more explanations to assist your storytelling. So this way of telling your story, your life experiences up to this point, is good because you don't translate from text to text. You simply translate from your memory into text, your second language directly. But of course, you have to learn the vocabulary first, and then practice until you can pronounce the word no problem, no difficulties whatsoever, either in speech or in writing. You just practice until you sound natural. Okay, now let's say you like to trick your brain to think that you have actually experienced those events in your first and second language. as if you have lived two different lives in two different languages. Your first language life experience is already done, so you don't really have to go through that once again. But as far as your second language is concerned, maybe you're not really satisfied with the first method I just described, learning the new vocabulary and then just play out in your head, and then just play out in your second language, and then explaining any cultural differences. Maybe that's not good enough for you. You like to trick your brain to think that you actually have experienced in your second language all these different events in your life. This takes us back to how our brain remembers things. When we try to recall what happened in the past, all we get is visuals, basically all different senses, right? The emotional memory, olfactory memory, which is a sense of smell, sense of hearing, all these different senses that are associated with those events. So, plus when it comes to learning another language, a second language, you also have this cultural memory, because if you have understood the cultural differences, right? That should have been stored in your memory as well. So once you understand both cultures, your first language culture and the second language culture in these different events, and you already played out all of your past experience in your second language, and you know all the vocabulary to replace your first language spoken in those events, right? So once you got this dialed down, your next step would be lie to your brain, lie to yourself, as if you have experienced these events in both languages, first or and second. How do we do that? I guess it's like pretend until you make it, or just fake it until you make it. Because the end result of remembering things is always the same. Your brain is just bringing about the images and, all the senses, the emotions and the pictures and smells and what you heard in those events. It really just has to do with our senses. So that's the end result of all. So in other words, as long as you can remember these images related to the events and the memories, as long as your brain can bring about those different sensations associated with those events, you remember those events in both languages. So again, imagination here is key in this type of training. And then maybe you have to train yourself to, fool your brain. So you have two different versions of your story, your past life experiences. The first one is the one that you have really experienced in your first language, and the other one is in your imagination. You implemented your imagination to recreate those your life experiences, life events in your second language, and then you successfully fooled your brain to believe that it actually happened to you. So now you have two different versions of your story. And when you talk about your life experiences, you have several ways to do so when you talking to the people. The first one is you can use the vocabulary expressions that are most synonymous with your first language to explain what happened in those events. In addition to some more extra explanations on the cultural difference associated with these events. Another way to talk about your life experiences in your second language would be pretend you have actually experienced it in your second language. All those life experiences you have had so far, as if it took place in your second language. You've already done it. You already know all this vocabulary necessary to illustrate those events. You already played out loud in your head, as if you have experienced it in your second language. And now you have the understanding of the cultural differences in those events between two different cultures. So there's no problem actually for you to kind of switch back and forth between two different versions here of your story. You can only do that. You can only do that with enough practice. The first, like I said before in the beginning, you have to know the vocabulary and expressions to describe these events you have experienced, and then you have to study about the cultural differences, and you have to fully understand what the differences are, and then you practice to pronounce these words that you learn to explain your life experiences in your second language, so you can put it on autopilot someday. You don't really have to. You don't even have to think about it when you talking about your life up to this point. So it takes a lot of effort. It's more like sports in this respect. It's more physical when it comes to learning to pronounce these words. You know the meaning, but when you pronounce it, it just comes wrongly. So that's one of the most difficulties that the adult language learner is facing. So, well, I'm gonna get to the pronunciation part, how we can actually train our tongue. I'm not gonna like ask you to pull it out or anything like that. But anyways, it's not really easy. One of the most difficult challenges that we have to face as a language learner is to overcome the sounds that we've been so used to, habituated. So we're gonna get to that in, I guess, the next episode. I'm not really sure yet, but I'm planning to elaborate on that as well in the future episode. So stay tuned, guys.